She was still in her wedding dress when the three of them dragged her down the church steps, and not one of them knew that the quiet man they'd have to answer to was already watching from the ridge above the valley. Meredith Hale had spent 28 years learning that the world doesn't hand widows and single mothers anything for free. She'd buried a husband, swallowed a mountain of his debt, worked a dying dairy farm from dark to dark, and raised a 6-year-old girl named Poppy, who still believed the world was mostly good, mostly kind. It was on a rainy afternoon not long ago that girl had come running through the rain to tell her mother there was a man asleep by the creek, and Meredith had pulled a half-drowned stranger out of the water with no papers, no memory, and nothing in his pockets but a heavy silver ring she couldn't read. She'd named him Leo, she'd fed him, healed him, fallen for him the patient, careful man who fixed her fences and taught her daughter to draw, and never once raised his voice. What she didn't know, what nobody in that little Vermont town knew, was that the man had a real name, and the real name was Lombardi, and back in the city they still whispered it like a curse. He was 36 years old, and before the river took his memory, he'd run the ports of an entire seaboard with a cold hand and an older code, and the men who'd tried to kill him had spent every day since believing they'd succeeded. This morning he'd risen before dawn and driven 2 hours to fetch something he hadn't told Meredith about, something meant to be a surprise, and when he crested the ridge and looked down at his own wedding, he saw 4 figures where there should have been friends, 2 men gripping his bride by the arms, a lawyer on the steps, holding a folder full of forged paper, and a car idling at the curb with a shape in the back seat he didn't yet recognize but somehow already hated. He stopped, and then one of the 3 men below made the mistake of glancing up. His face went the color of wet ash, because he'd seen that stillness once before, 3 years ago, on the worst morning of his life. When the man wearing it had lowered a gun, he'd had every right to fire and said, "You don't have to die for another man's money, walk away." Nobody in that valley knew what Leo used to be. In about 90 seconds, they were all going to find out. If a story about a broken woman, a hunted man, and the little girl who tied them together is the kind of thing you'd sit by the fire for, do me a favor before we go on, hit that like button. Share this with somebody who believes people can change, and subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. Now let's go back to the rainy afternoon by the creek, where a mother pulled a stranger out of the water, and had no idea she was saving the most dangerous man in 3 states. That afternoon, the rain fell as though the sky were trying to drown the whole valley, and Poppy ran home with mud up to her ankles on her rubber boots, her hair plastered to her forehead, her mouth crying out that there was a man sleeping down in the creek, and he wouldn't wake up. Meredith was halfway through milking in the barn when she heard her child's voice, and there was something inside it, a fear a 6-year-old child couldn't pretend, that made her drop the milk pail onto the damp concrete floor and run after her daughter toward the edge of the field, across the broken fence and the waterlogged grass, to the little creek that was usually gentle, but had now swollen to a muddy rush because of the rain that had been falling since the night before. The man was lying on his side, with half his body in the water, one arm caught on a bare tree root along the bank, and without that root holding him there, the current would probably have carried him away long ago. Meredith told Poppy to stand back by the maple tree, to stay right there and not come any closer. Then she waded down into the creek, the cold water cutting into her calves, the mud sucking at every step, and slid both hands under the stranger's arms to pull him. He was heavy as a wet stone, his soaked clothes dragging him back toward the bed of the creek, and it took several minutes of struggling, slipping, falling, and forcing herself up again before she finally dragged him onto a higher patch of grass. There was a long gash on his right temple, the blood already clotted into a dark brown mixed with mud, and around it the flesh had swollen into a frightening ring of purple bruising. She pressed her ear to his chest in the rain, waiting through a moment that stretched long enough to steal her breath. And then she felt it, a heartbeat faint but steady, and a shallow breath trembling out of him. He was alive. She wasn't strong enough to carry him, so she ran back for the old wagon hitched behind the tractor, lined it with a tarp and several horse blankets. Then, with all her strength and a length of wood used as a lever, she managed to roll him onto it. Poppy walked beside him the whole way home, her tiny hand resting on the stranger's ankle as if she were afraid he might vanish, asking over and over, "Mama, is he going to die?" And Meredith only answered, "No, sweetheart, not today. in a voice far steadier than anything she truly believed. When they reached the house, she laid him on the old settee in the living room, cut away his wet shirt, dried him off, and covered him with the thickest blankets she had. Then she did what a woman raised in the country knows how to do when there isn't a hospital within 40 miles and no money to pay for it. She cleaned the wound with warm salt water, pressed gently to slow the bleeding, and wrapped it with clean gauze. But the swelling at his temple worried her. It didn't look like an ordinary cut, so she lifted the landline and called Mrs. Ada Whitlock at the house half a mile away, a 72-year-old woman who had worked as an emergency room nurse for 30 years in Burlington before retiring, the woman the whole area still turned to whenever a child ran a high fever or a finger got caught in a machine. Mrs. Ada came in a yellow raincoat, carrying her faded cloth bag, and she knelt beside the stranger with the calm of someone who had seen too many broken bodies to panic anymore. She shone a small flashlight into both of his pupils to see whether they contracted evenly, pressed gently around the swelling, counted his breaths, then told Meredith in a steady, low voice that he had suffered a severe blow to the head, that he had probably struck a rock while being carried by the water, that he needed to be watched through the night and awakened every few hours, and that if by morning he was vomiting badly or slipping deeper into unconsciousness, they would have to get him down to town no matter what. That night, Meredith sat beside the settee with the oil lamp turned low, while the rain kept lashing against the windows, and she woke him exactly as Mrs. Ada had instructed. Near dawn, he opened his eyes, his clouded gray gaze moving from the ceiling to her, and when she asked him what his name was, the man stayed silent for a long while, his lips moving faintly as though he were searching for something that should have been there all along, and then he whispered in a hoarse, rough voice that he didn't know, that he couldn't remember anything at all, not a name, not a face, not a single piece of himself. The next morning, Sheriff Boyd Kessler drove up to the farm, listened as Meredith told him what had happened, bent down to look at the man who was still pale on the settee, then wrote a few lines in his worn, cornered notebook, and promised he would send notices to the neighboring counties and check the missing persons lists. But many days passed and nothing came back, not a single report, not one photograph that matched his face, not one abandoned car found on the roads along the river, as if this man had fallen straight out of another life into the creek behind her house, without leaving behind even one thread tying him back to wherever he had come from. Kessler told her it was strange, that people usually had someone looking for them, and that the very fact that no one was looking made him uneasy in the way it does a man who has been in the job too long. But he had nothing in his hands to do more with, so in the end the man remained there, an empty name lying inside the house of a woman who already had too much to carry. Because the farm was dying slowly, and Meredith knew it better than anyone every time she sat at the kitchen table at midnight with a stack of bills and an expense ledger whose numbers grew redder month by month. Her herd had fewer than 30 cows. The price of milk had fallen to a level a small farm like hers could almost no longer survive. The milking machine kept breaking down, the barn roof leaked, and the loan she had signed with the bank in town came due for interest every quarter, like a ticking clock she had no way to stop. The credit manager, a man named Prentice in a stiff starched shirt, had called her into his office twice to remind her that if she missed one more payment, the file would be transferred to asset recovery, and the way he said it, softly, almost regretfully, chilled her spine more than if he had shouted. But the thing that kept her awake more than the bank was Earl Vance, her late husband's uncle, a 58-year-old man with a smile that always looked as if it was calculating something, a man who for more than a year had been circling the farm with the same refrain, telling her she should sell the west field that bordered the main road, that a woman raising a child alone shouldn't hold on to so much weight, that he was willing to pay a fair price to help lighten her burden. She knew that land was worth many times the price he was offering, knew it sat right along the route people rumored would be widened, and she knew Earl Vance wasn't the kind of man who did anything without profit for himself. So every time he came by, she stood blocking the doorway, arms folded over her chest, answering him with sentences, short enough and polite enough, not to turn into open hostility, but cold enough for him to understand that the answer was no. In the middle of everything tightening around her, taking in a nameless man with no memory and no papers was the sort of thing every sensible rule in the world told her not to do. and she considered that very seriously during those first nights, sitting there watching him sleep and wondering what kind of danger she was bringing into a house with a little girl. She wasn't gullible, and she noticed a few things about him that made her cautious. The way he woke by coming fully alert at once instead of surfacing groggily like a sick man. The way his eyes swept the whole room before coming to rest on her. But when he was strong enough to stand, the first thing he did wasn't ask for anything. He simply went out into the yard, looked at the leaking barn roof, and asked her whether she had any nails and a hammer. So they came to an unspoken agreement that gradually became spoken. He would sleep in the small loft above the hay barn, eat at the same table with mother and daughter, and in return he would work, repair, and shoulder whatever a man could shoulder on a farm that was short of hands until he remembered who he was, or until someone came looking for him, something that with every passing day they both silently understood might never happen. In those first weeks living in the loft above the hay barn, the nameless man revealed habits Meredith couldn't explain, and the more she watched him, the more she felt they didn't match his quiet, modest appearance at all. Every time he stepped into a room, the first thing he did was glance lightly toward the doors and windows, counting them in a fleeting look that even he didn't seem to realize he was making. Then he chose a seat with his back always to the wall, and his face turned toward the entrance, never sitting in the middle, never leaving an open space behind him that he couldn't control. Once, Mrs. Ada came by to check the wound on his head, and she entered the kitchen without knocking, and he had already turned before the door had fully opened, his whole body tightening for a fraction of a second before easing when he realized it was only the old woman. And Mrs. Ada, who had seen all kinds of people pass through an emergency room, looked at him for a very long time, then quietly told Meredith out on the porch that she didn't know where this man had come from. But that reflex wasn't something people learned from herding cows or building tables and chairs. He could fix everything, and that was something Meredith was grateful for. But it was also what confused her, because he didn't feel his way through things like an apprentice. He went straight to the broken part, as though his hands remembered what his mind had forgotten. He took apart the old milking machine that had tormented her all winter, laid every piece in a neat line on a spread cloth, found the worn valve even the mechanic down in town hadn't noticed, then put it all back together without one screw missing or left over. One afternoon, she was sitting at the kitchen table, struggling with the column in the expense ledger, adding and adding again through several long rows of numbers that kept coming out with two different results, and he merely stood beside her, glanced over her shoulder for less than a few seconds, and read out the final number, accurate down to the cent, calmly, as though he had finished reading the whole column long before she ever picked up the pencil, and when she lifted her eyes to him in astonishment, he looked bewildered too, as if he had just heard a stranger's voice coming out of his own mouth. But the thing she would remember most was the afternoon Earl Vance prowled back up to the farm, this time with two unfamiliar, thick-shouldered men he introduced as helpers, and he spoke louder than usual, moving too close to Meredith in the middle of the yard, while the other two men stood off to either side as if trying to pen her in. The nameless man was replacing a board on the cattle barn some distance away, and he didn't shout, didn't charge forward. He only set the hammer down, walked slowly across the yard, and came to stand a little behind Meredith at an angle, silent, both hands hanging loose at his sides, his calm eyes passing from one man to the next before coming to rest on Earl. And for some reason that absolute stillness, the way he had placed himself in the exact position where he could see all three men at once, made the two big men visibly uneasy. One of them instinctively stepped back half a pace, while Earl swallowed, lost his appetite for the confrontation, muttered a few words, then dragged his men back to the truck and left sooner than he had planned. That night, the man sat for a long time on the step outside the loft, looking at his own hands in the moonlight, as if they belonged to someone else, trying to understand why his body knew things he didn't remember learning, why in front of three threatening men he hadn't felt fear, but only a cold calm rising from somewhere very deep, and that frightened him more than anything, because an ordinary decent man shouldn't carry in his blood the reflexes of someone accustomed to danger, and he began to fear, dimly and terribly, that the person he had once been, the person hidden behind the black curtain inside his mind, might not have been a good man, If that man made Meredith cautious, with Poppy it was the complete opposite. The little girl clung to him almost from the day she found him in the creek, as though, in the clear, bright mind of a 6-year-old child, the fact that she had discovered him herself had turned him into something that belonged only to her. A secret, a friend, a treasure, pulled up from the water. Since he had no name, she called him Uncle No Name, saying it in the solemn matter-of-fact voice of a child. Uncle No Name. Help me tie my shoes, Uncle No Name. That cow ran off again, and he never seemed bothered by that strange name. On the contrary, every time he heard the little girl call him that, something in his eyes, which were always so watchful, softened and eased, like a door cracking open into a room he himself had forgotten he possessed. He taught her to draw, and that was something no one expected. One afternoon, the little girl was sitting there busily scribbling a cow that looked more like a sack than an animal, and he picked up the little piece of pencil, slowly showing her how to see an object as simple shapes before drawing it, how light fell on one side and shadow rested on the other, and his hands moved across the page with a certainty that made Meredith stand still in the doorway, because here was yet another thing he knew how to do without remembering where he had learned it. But this time it didn't chill her the way those other reflexes had. This time it only made something warm and sorrowful ache inside her at once. He rebuilt the crooked cattle pen, and he let Poppy help in the way patient adults do with children, giving her the job of holding the tip of a nail, handing her a piece of sandpaper, calling her his chief assistant in such a solemn voice that the little girl stuck out her chest with pride all day. And when the pen was finished, sturdier and straighter than anything on that farm had been in years, she stood there admiring it with the pride of someone who had built every bit of it with her own hands. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, Poppy curled up on his lap, pointing at the sky and asking the names of the stars. And he made up names when he didn't know them, speaking in a voice so low and warm that the little girl believed every word, while Meredith sat beside them quietly watching, feeling something that hadn't existed in this house for a very long time. A fragile peace she both longed for and feared, because she understood that anything resting on a man who could vanish at any moment was too dangerous to trust. It was because the little girl kept calling him Uncle No Name that one evening Meredith picked up the heavy silver ring she had kept in a drawer since that rainy night, the only thing he had carried on him, and held it under the lamp, turning it in her hand. On the face of the ring was an emblem worn smooth by the years. She couldn't read the letters around it, but in the center she clearly recognized the image of a lion rearing up, its mane raised, its head lifted high with pride, and she handed it to him and asked whether he remembered anything, but he only stared at it for a very long time, then shook his head. The emptiness in his eyes then made her unable to ask any more. The lion, she said softly, almost to herself. In Latin people call it Leo. And she lifted her eyes to him, trying the name once to see if it fit. Leo, and he gave a faint nod, accepting it the way a person accepts a gift from the hands of someone he has begun to trust. And from that moment on, the nameless man had a name, not his true name, which was still asleep somewhere behind the black curtain, but the name a decent woman had given him beneath the oil lamp. And Poppy clapped her hands and cried out that Uncle No Name finally had a name now. And all three of them laughed together in the small warm kitchen in the cold Vermont countryside. The name had only just begun to take root when spring arrived with its storms, and on a night in late March, while the wind battered the walls of the hay barn and hail rattled against the tin roof, one of Meredith's best cows went into labor and couldn't finish. The calf turned the wrong way inside its mother, and Meredith knew from the first look that if nature was left to itself, she would lose both cow and calf that night, a loss her gasping little farm couldn't possibly bear. She ran out to the barn to call Leo through the thunder, and he came down at once, asking few questions, only rolling up his sleeves while she explained. And together they knelt on the damp floor of the stall, beneath the light of a storm lantern hanging from a beam, the mother cow bawling in pain, her flanks heaving, while Meredith tried to keep her calm and slipped a hand in to check, confirming what she feared most. The calf's two hind legs were coming first, with its head and shoulders trapped inside. She had once helped deliver a backward calf with her father many years earlier, but she had never done it alone, and her hands weren't strong enough to pull in time with the mother cow's contractions, so Leo knelt close beside her, following every word she gave him with absolute focus, and amid the smell of damp straw and blood and sweat, amid the storm howling outside, the two of them worked together as though they had done this 100 times before. She signaled with her eyes and he understood. She said pull and he pulled, steady, firm, waiting until the mother cow strained before adding more force so nothing inside would tear. There was a long, breathless moment when the calf didn't move, stuck fast, and Meredith had almost fallen into despair, but Leo laid his large hand over hers, not to take over but to give her his strength, and he said in a calm, low voice, "Together now. Just one more time," and they pulled in rhythm, and the calf slid out in a rush of warm birth water, spilling into both their arms, soaked motionless. For 1 second, they both froze, thinking they were too late, and then Leo immediately did what his hand seemed to know before his mind did, grabbing a handful of dry straw and rubbing hard at the calf's chest, clearing its nose, while Meredith pushed a straw into the animal's nostril to stimulate it, and then the calf sneezed, startled, and its tiny chest swelled to take its first breath, trembling but alive, and the mother cow turned her head and let out a low sound of relief before beginning to lick her baby. Meredith burst out laughing, a breaking laugh tangled with tears she couldn't hold back, and when she looked up, she caught Leo looking at the calf with a rare smile, the first real smile she had seen on his face since the day he arrived, a smile without defense, without caution, and in the yellow light of the storm lantern, both of them covered in straw and mud and blood, exhausted and happy. They looked at each other longer than an ordinary moment should last, and something quietly changed between them without either one giving it a name. She handed him an old towel, their hands touching briefly, and she realized this was the first time in a very long while that she didn't feel alone in the struggle to hold this place together, that the man sitting beside her, though he didn't know who he was, had proven again and again that he was someone who showed up on the exact nights when someone needed to show up, someone who reached out his hand without asking for anything in return, and the caution she had forced herself to keep. For all those weeks began to crack little by little, not because she had stopped being careful, but because she had gathered more than enough proof to believe. They sat in silence beside the newborn calf until it managed to rise on 4 trembling legs and search for its mother's milk. And as the storm outside slowly softened, Meredith knew that something inside her had also been born that night, fragile and wet and new, and she didn't dare name it yet, but she no longer wanted to push it away. But just as his heart began to allow itself to believe that this place might belong to him, the black curtain in his mind began to crack, and what seeped through those cracks was not comfort but terror. At first, they were only loose fragments that came in his sleep, headlights flashing across wet glass, the smell of cold steel and leather, the sensation of something heavy fitting perfectly into his right palm, so that even after waking, he could still feel his fingers curled around that exact shape. And he would lie in the darkness of the loft, listening to his heart pound, trying to understand why his hand remembered holding something his reason couldn't name. Then the dreams grew sharper, night after night, and one night he woke with gunfire, still ringing in his ears, not some vague explosion but clear bursts of bullets, rapid, directed, and in the dream he hadn't panicked at those sounds. That was what chilled him when he woke, because in the dream he moved through the gunfire calmly, deliberately, like a man far too familiar with it, and he didn't know whether he had been the one being shot at or the one pulling the trigger, and that not knowing gnawed at him even more savagely than the answer. There was one image that kept returning, more persistent than all the rest, the image of black water flooding into an enclosed space, rising around his feet, around his chest, while the light above the surface drew farther away and his lungs burned, and he understood dimly that this was the night the creek had given him back to Meredith, the fragile border between the old life he had lost and the new life he was living. But what tormented him was that before the water came rushing in, something had happened, something violent, something that had made people want him dead, and among all those broken pieces, a name rose up. Not his name, but a blurred sound someone in the dream had called him with a voice both frightened and reverent, a name that began with a sound as heavy as stone rolling, and every time he tried to reach for it, it slipped from his hand like a slick fish, leaving in his mouth an aftertaste of power and blood. He didn't tell Meredith about those dreams, and he told himself he kept silent so she wouldn't worry, but deep down, he knew the real reason was far more frightening. He stayed silent because he was afraid of what he was about to remember, afraid that the man waiting for him behind the black curtain was someone those gunshots and that stone-heavy name belonged to, someone decent people would avoid, someone a mother with a small child should never have brought into her home. By day he was still Leo, still mending fences, still teaching Poppy to draw, still sitting at the warm table for supper and catching Meredith's eyes before feeling his heart soften. But by night he lay awake staring at the rafters and being torn between two men, the man he was becoming in this place, patient and gentle and needed for honest reasons, and the dark shadow he had once been, drawing closer every day through each dream. There were mornings when he stood watching Meredith cross the yard with the milk pail in her hand, watching Poppy run after her, stumble, then burst into laughter, and he felt a cold fear rise in him, the fear that the past he couldn't remember would not stay buried at the bottom of that creek, that one day it would find a way to follow the trail back, and when it came back, it would not come alone, and he would have no way to protect mother and daughter from the very man he had once been, the man he now only prayed would stay asleep forever and never wake. Earl Vance wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily, and when sweet words and attempts to corner Meredith in the yard failed to move her, he turned to a far more dangerous weapon, paperwork. One morning in early summer, a process server drove up to the farm and handed her a thick stack of documents, and when she sat down at the kitchen table with trembling hands and opened them to read, she felt her heart tighten. Because Earl was suing to claim ownership of the western parcel that bordered the main road, and the evidence he presented was an old transfer agreement, supposedly signed by her late husband years before, a document stating that her husband had agreed to deed that land over to Earl to settle a debt, complete with a signature and even a faint notary stamp in the corner. Meredith knew with absolute certainty in her heart that it couldn't be true. Her husband had never mentioned any debt to Earl, never said he would give away the piece of land he loved most. But knowing something in her heart was one thing, proving it in court was something else entirely, and when she took the documents to the only lawyer in town, he looked them over, sighed, and said the signature looked very similar. The papers seemed valid, and if she wanted to challenge them, she would have to hire a handwriting expert, an expensive process that, in her situation, was nearly impossible, and he advised her to consider negotiating. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread beneath the lamp, both hands covering her face, while Poppy slept, and she felt the ring around her tightening another notch, the bank on one side, Earl on the other, and herself alone in the middle. Leo came in and poured her a cup of tea, then he saw the agreement lying on top, and his gaze stopped there longer than usual. That sharp, cold look she had learned meant his mind was doing something he couldn't explain. He picked up the paper, tilted it beneath the light, brought it closer to his eyes, and said quietly that something wasn't right here, that this signature had been written too slowly, that the strokes were unnaturally even, because when people sign their real names, the hand moves quickly, with places where it presses and places where it releases, while this handwriting trembled and hesitated, like the work of someone tracing over a model already laid out. And he showed her where the ink had pooled at the beginning of each stroke, the sign of a pen nib pausing too long. Then he looked at the notary seal, and he said the date stamped here, reading out the year, then asked Meredith when the notary whose name was stamped there had begun practicing in this county, because if they could find out that in the year written on the paper she had not yet been licensed, or that this notary commission number had not yet been issued at that time, then the entire document would collapse, because a seal couldn't exist before the day someone had the legal right to use it. Meredith stared at him, stunned, because this wasn't the way a fence repairman thought. This was the way someone accustomed to taking fraudulent papers apart looked at a page, but in that moment she didn't stop to be afraid of it. She only felt the first thread of hope inside her chest. Together they traced the notary's professional records at the county archive, and just as Leo had suspected, the seal number on the agreement had only been issued to her 2 years after the date written on Earl's document, a discrepancy so small that no one had noticed it, but fatal enough to prove the paper was a forgery. When Meredith's lawyer presented that evidence, Earl's lawsuit was dismissed right at the preliminary hearing, and this time she kept the land, not with money, not with fists, but with one tiny detail Leo's eyes had seen. But when Earl walked out of the courthouse, He didn't look like a man who had just lost. He only glanced toward Leo with narrowed, searching eyes, the look of someone who had just realized that the nameless hired hand on Meredith's farm was not as simple as he appeared. And that gaze lingered long enough to send a chill up Meredith's spine, because she understood Earl wasn't the kind of man who lost once and let go. He was only stepping back to find another way, and she didn't know that this way had already begun taking shape in his mind at that very moment. Summer passed over the farm, which had begun to come back to life in some measure because of Leo's hands, and the quiet thing that had taken root between them on the night the calf was born grew larger through every supper, every afternoon spent working together in the fields, every moment when their eyes met and then hurried away, until they both knew, though neither dared say it aloud, that it had become something that could no longer be called by any name but love. On an evening in late August, when the setting sun stained the fields red, and Poppy was sound asleep upstairs, Leo asked Meredith to come sit with him by the western fence, on the very piece of land he had helped her keep, and she knew at once that something was different in his silence, a tension she had never seen in the man who was always calm before everything. He worried a dry blade of grass between his fingers for a long time before he spoke, and his voice was lower than usual as he said he had been thinking about this for a very long time, longer than she imagined, that he knew he had nothing to give her, not a real name, not a past, not any promise that tomorrow someone wouldn't step out of the place he had come from to claim back the man he used to be. Then he turned and looked straight into her eyes, and with a naked honesty that made her throat tighten, he said he didn't know who he had once been, perhaps he would never know, but he did know one thing for certain. He knew who he was now, right here, the man sitting beside her, and that man belonged to her, completely, with nothing hidden, nothing held back. He said he was afraid, and he didn't hide that from her. He was afraid of the dark shadow in his dreams, afraid that loving her was selfish when he couldn't be sure he wouldn't bring danger to her door. But then he said he had tried to push this feeling away for months, and he couldn't, because waking every morning on this farm, being needed by her, being called by name by Poppy, was the only thing that made him feel like a decent man, and he didn't want to live without that anymore. Then he drew from his shirt pocket a braided grass ring, only a ring of dry field grass he had woven with his own hands, because he had nothing more to offer, and he asked her, his voice roughening, whether she would be willing to become his wife, willing to marry a man who had only the name she herself had given him. Meredith sat silent for a long time, and in that moment all the fears she had carried for months rose inside her at once. The fear of his nameless past, of the cold reflexes she had seen in him, of the day someone might come looking, and she understood better than anyone that saying yes meant accepting that dark shadow as part of the bargain. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see the shadow. She saw the man who had waded into the cold creek, the man who had helped her bring a calf into the world, the man who had taught her daughter to draw the stars, the man who had saved this land with his mind instead of his fists. And she realized she wasn't choosing the person he had once been, the person neither of them knew. She was choosing the person he had decided to become here, day by day, with every small act. And she said, softly but surely, that she didn't need to know who he had been. She only needed the man sitting in front of her now, that she knew who he was, Leo. And she took the braided grass ring from his hand and slipped it onto her finger as if it were the most precious thing in the world. He gently touched his forehead to hers, and they sat there beneath the deepening violet sky of Vermont, two people with different wounds who had found each other in a hidden corner of the world, not knowing that many miles away, in a city neither of them had ever named, wheels had already begun to turn, and the past Leo had prayed would sleep forever was quietly waking up, many miles south of that Vermont countryside. In the seaside city of Providence, there was a man named August Delaney whom everyone in the underworld still called Gus, and for more than a year Gus hadn't had a single full night's sleep, because he was the only man in the entire Lombardi organization who still stubbornly believed that his boss wasn't dead. Gus was past 40, a broad, powerful man with close-cut graying hair, and the eyes of someone who had seen too many things he could never forget. He had stood beside Gerald Lombardi for nearly 20 years, ever since they were both street kids, and he knew that man so well that he couldn't accept the conclusion everyone else had rushed to nod along with, that the car plunging into the water that night had taken the boss away, along with everything he had built. No body had ever been found, and to Gus, without a body there was no death, only an unanswered question, and he had spent the last 14 months quietly searching for the answer to that question, silently, carefully, without letting other eyes know what he was looking for. He had people to check every hospital, every morgue, every police station along the river and beyond. He followed the faintest rumors about nameless men washed ashore, men with lost memories, strange faces appearing in isolated places, and at every dead end he returned to the stubborn belief that the man he knew didn't die that easily, that if there was any way to survive, Gerald Lombardi would have found it. But Gus had to be extremely careful, because he wasn't the only one who cared whether his boss was still alive, and the others cared for reasons completely opposite from his own. Since that fateful night, the empire Lombardi had left behind had begun to be eaten away piece by piece, the docks, the routes, the businesses that had once rested firmly in the boss's hands now gradually falling under the control of another man, Conrad Fisk, the head of a long-time rival family, and the very man Gus was certain had been behind the night someone had tried to send Gerald to the bottom of the river. Conrad Fisk was past 50, a tall, thin man with smooth silver hair and perfectly tailored suits, a man who received guests in an oak-paneled office overlooking the harbor, poured aged whiskey with a hand that never trembled, and killed people with a signature or a phone call instead of dirtying his own hands. Fisk was the most dangerous kind of evil, calm, courteous, patient, the kind of man who regarded violence as only one tool among many and always preferred the tools that left the fewest traces. And for more than a year he had behaved like a victor, taking over what Lombardi had left behind with the unhurried ease of a man who believed the greatest rival of his life was lying beneath the river. But recently a small thing had begun to disturb that ease, scraps of information reaching Fisk's people, an old Lombardi man seen asking questions in faraway places, quiet inquiries about an unnamed man, and Fisk, who didn't believe in coincidence, understood perfectly well that as long as there wasn't a corpse lying there, an empire built in blood could still call its old master back. He summoned his trusted men to the wood-paneled office overlooking the harbor, and in that soft voice that made the listener's spine go cold, he ordered them to find out what Gus Delaney was sniffing after, to make certain that the night in the river had ended as completely as he believed. Because if Gerald Lombardi was still breathing somewhere in this world, then everything Conrad Fisk had just taken was standing on borrowed ground, and a man like Fisk could never endure the thought that something in his hands might be claimed back at any moment. While the two forces in Providence were feeling their way toward each other in the dark, the link that connected them to that peaceful Vermont countryside came from a place no one would have expected, from Earl Vance's own petty greed. After losing in court and swallowing the humiliation of having his claim dismissed at the preliminary hearing, Earl didn't calm down. He only grew more bitter, and what gnawed at him most was not the land that had slipped from his grasp, but the face of the nameless hired man who had exposed him, that man who had appeared out of nowhere, and somehow knew how to unmask a forged document like a professional. Earl was the kind of man who believed everyone had a secret that could be used, and he suspected that this fellow who claimed not to remember who he was must be hiding something. So instead of showing his face at the farm again, this time he chose silence. He scraped together the last of his meager money and hired a second-rate private investigator from down in the city, a man named Rourke, who specialized in dirty jobs and didn't ask why, and he gave him one simple task: dig up the true identity of the man living on Meredith Hale's land. Rourke came up to Vermont, set up a long lens camera in the brush across the road, and waited patiently for days, photographing Leo repairing the fence, Leo carrying Poppy on his shoulders, Leo walking with Meredith among the cows, frames of ordinary happiness that none of the three people inside them knew were being recorded by a cold lens. But one photograph changed everything. One afternoon, Leo rolled up his sleeves to wash his face beside the pump, and Rourke pressed the shutter. At the exact moment his right hand lifted, and on that finger, the thing Meredith had returned to him after he accepted the name Leo, the heavy silver ring carved with a rearing lion, appeared clear as day beneath the sun. Rourke wasn't important enough to understand what it meant, but he was smart enough to know that an old signet ring, with a family crest like that, wasn't something that belonged to a country hired hand, so he did what men like him always did. He took the photograph around to his shadowy contacts and asked whether anyone recognized the crest, offering it up like merchandise. And the rumor of a photograph bearing a lion crest passed from ear to ear through the underbelly of the city until it reached the very people it should have avoided most. Because that rearing lion crest was the mark of the Lombardi bloodline, and when the photograph was finally placed on the oak, paneled desk in the office overlooking the harbor, Conrad Fisk bent over it for a long time without saying a word, and in that moment all the composure he had worn for more than a year fell from his face like a mask, slipping from its hook, revealing underneath something that was both fear and cold fury. The man in the photograph was thinner, his hair longer, dressed like a farmer, but Fisk had spent his life memorizing the face of the greatest rival he had ever had, and he knew at once, though his reason wanted to deny it, that Gerald Lombardi was still alive, still breathing, hiding in some backwater corner of Vermont with a ring he hadn't even bothered to take off his hand. The irony of it all was that Earl Vance had never heard the name Lombardi, had never been capable of imagining that his small greedy desire to reclaim a widow's land had just pulled away the last veil protecting that man, that he had accidentally done what an entire underworld empire, with all its money and all its men, had failed to do for more than a year. He had found Gerald Lombardi and delivered him straight into the hands of the man who wanted him dead. And while in Vermont, Leo and Meredith were beginning to talk about an autumn wedding, completely unaware of anything, in the harbor office, Conrad Fisk quietly folded the photograph, placed it in a drawer, and began calculating exactly when he should end this for good. Conrad Fisk wasn't a man who acted in haste, and for many days after the photograph lay tucked inside his desk drawer, he sat in his wood-paneled office and calculated every move with the coldness of a chess player who had already seen the whole board in advance. He understood that killing a man who didn't remember who he was, a man living quietly in the middle of a rural community where everyone knew everyone's face, couldn't be done in the old way, with a gunshot in the night and then disappearance, because that would leave behind a body, an investigation, and worst of all, it would turn Gerald Lombardi into a story, while Fisk wanted him to vanish without leaving even a ripple behind. So he devised something far more refined. He wouldn't come as a killer, but as the law. He would wrap death in the clothing of papers and procedure, so that when everything was finished, it would all look like a lawful property dispute that had unfortunately slipped beyond control, and no one would think to trace it back to the office overlooking the harbor. To do that, he summoned Hollis Brandt, the family's private attorney, a man in his 40s with a smooth face and a conscience he had sold long ago. Someone gifted at turning false things into things that looked exactly real in black ink on white paper. Fisk laid on the desk the file on Meredith Hale's farm, on her bank debts, on the land claim lawsuit that a man named Earl Vance had just lost, and he ordered Brandt to build a complete foreclosure package, a chain of forged debt transfer documents that would make the entire farm, land, and people alike appear to be property his organization had the right to come and seize. A legal excuse on the surface to send his men straight through her front door in broad daylight, with no one able to stop them. And Fisk chose the timing with calculated cruelty. He knew through his men that the woman was about to be married, that the whole town would gather at the church on a Saturday morning in early October, and he decided that was exactly when he would strike, because amid a crowd gathered in joy, the panic would be greatest, the resistance would be weakest, and Gerald Lombardi, always most dangerous when prepared, would be ambushed at the very moment he was most unguarded, dressed for his wedding, unarmed, standing among the people he wanted to protect. While that machinery of death was being assembled gear by gear in Providence, Gus Delaney had also finally reached the lead he had been searching for over the last 14 months, because the same rumor about the photograph bearing the lion crest that had led Fisk to Vermont eventually reached one of Gus's old sources as well. And the moment he heard the words lion crest come from the informant's mouth, his heart began pounding in a way it hadn't in a very long time, because he knew at once that there was no doubt left, his boss was alive. But that joy immediately froze into terror, because Gus understood all too well that if the information had reached his ears, then it had almost certainly reached Fisk's too, and perhaps earlier, and that meant he was racing against a killing machine that had already started one step ahead of him. He hastily gathered what he needed, shoved into a briefcase a stack of files he had quietly collected for more than a year. Evidence about the night in the river, about what Fisk had done, then rushed to his car and drove north toward the small town in Vermont, whose name he had only just learned, with a road of many hours stretching before him, and one single fear gnawing at him the entire way, the fear that no matter how hard he pressed the gas, he might still arrive only a few short minutes too late for that fateful Saturday morning. On the night before the wedding, no one on that small farm knew that there were cars moving toward them through the dark, and the house was steeped in a peace so sweet that afterward, every time Meredith remembered it, her heart would tighten because it had been so painfully pure. Supper that evening was only the three of them, like so many other suppers over the past year. But tonight there was something quietly solemn laid over everything. Meredith had stewed a pot of meat, Poppy was allowed to stay up later than usual, and the little girl kept bustling around the kitchen, asking all kinds of questions about tomorrow. "Mama, do I get to scatter flowers? Will Uncle Leo still be Uncle Leo tomorrow, or will he become Daddy?" And that innocent question made both adults go still. Then Leo set down his fork, turned to the child, and said in his warm, low voice that if she agreed, he would very much like her to call him Daddy. Poppy thought about it seriously for a while in the way children do, then nodded with firm certainty, and Meredith had to turn her face away to hide the tears that had blurred her eyes. After the meal, they sat by the fireplace, Poppy curled between them, drawing a family picture with 3 human heads, a herd of cows, and a house with smoke rising from the chimney, and the little girl solemnly announced that this was her wedding gift, then fell asleep right there with the pencil still in her hand. And Leo gently carried her upstairs and laid her in bed, pulling the blanket over her with the care of a man still astonished that such tender things had been entrusted to him. When he came back down, Meredith was standing by the window, looking out at the dark field, and he came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her, and they stood that way for a long time without saying anything, only listening to each other breathe and to the wind outside in the fields. And in that moment they both felt a happiness so full it almost hurt, the happiness of people who had passed through too much loss, and therefore understood exactly how fragile it was. She whispered that she still couldn't believe she had been given this once more, and he held her tighter, murmuring into her hair that he felt the same, that whether or not he ever remembered his entire old life, he had already found everything a human being could hope for right here in this place. They parted early to go to bed, because tomorrow would be a long day, and Leo lay in the hay barn loft for the last time, and strangely, that night he didn't dream of gunfire or black water. He slept a peaceful sleep, as if the dark shadow inside his mind also knew enough to make room for one quiet night. But he woke before the sky had brightened, long before dawn, silently dressing in the dark so he wouldn't wake anyone, because there was something he had to do, something he had been planning for weeks and had kept secret even from Meredith, something he wanted to give her as a surprise on their wedding day. He hurriedly wrote a few words and left them on the kitchen table, saying only that he had something to take care of for a little while and would be back in time for the ceremony. "Don't worry." Then he went out into the yard, started the old truck, and drove away into the early morning mist, crossing the empty country roads still damp with the breath of night, heading toward the small city 2 hours away, where something was waiting for him, something he believed would make this morning complete in the way he had always dreamed. He had no idea that as the taillights of his truck faded at the end of the road, other cars were approaching from the opposite direction, heading toward the church where the whole town would soon gather, and that the 2-hour road there and the 2-hour road back would put him in the wrong place at the exact moment when the woman he loved needed him most, and that when he returned and crossed the crest of the hill overlooking the valley, this peaceful morning would no longer be peaceful at all. That Saturday morning, the town's small white wooden church was packed full of people. The whole community had come, neighbors wearing their finest clothes, Mrs. Ada Whitlock, sitting in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and Meredith stood in the little room behind the sanctuary, in the simple wedding dress she had altered from her mother's gown, her heart beating fast as she waited for the hour to arrive, only slightly worried because Leo still hadn't come back, but the note he had left told her not to worry, so she tried to believe him. Poppy ran busily between the pews in her pink dress, holding her flower basket, proud of her role as the flower girl, and the church was filled with the plain, gentle happiness of a small community gathered to celebrate one of its own. Then the rumble of several engines outside shattered everything. 3 unfamiliar black cars gliding in and stopping across the way, blocking the entrance, and from them stepped several men in dark suits who did not belong there, led by a smooth-haired lawyer carrying a stack of documents. A man who walked straight up the church steps with the ease of someone who believed the papers in his hand made him untouchable. He introduced himself as Hollis Brandt, legal representative for the party that had acquired all outstanding debts tied to the Hale farm, and he announced in a cold voice that the entire property, including those currently residing on it, was now subject to his client's authority, that Meredith Hale needed to come with them at once to settle the matter. And the whole church fell silent for a moment, unable to understand what was happening. When Meredith stepped onto the threshold to protest, her voice trembling with both anger and fear, 2 men moved forward, seized her by both arms, and began dragging her away, and the sound of her wedding dress tearing at the shoulder mingled with her cry, causing the crowd to burst into chaos. A few men from town rushing forward only to stop short when they saw the dangerous bearing of the strangers. In the middle of that panic, the first thing Mrs. Ada did was grab Poppy, who stood frozen with her flower basket in her hands. She pressed the little girl's head against her chest, shielding her view with her own body, then, with another neighbor, hurriedly carried her through the side door and out behind the church, away from everything, so those childish eyes wouldn't have to watch her mother being torn from the stone steps. And the little girl's cries for her mother grew smaller, then disappeared behind the wooden wall. The 3rd car was still idling beside the road, its window lowered partway, and in the shadow of the back seat a figure sat motionless, watching it all with the calm of a man who had staged the whole performance and was now savoring it. Conrad Fisk didn't need to step out. He had come only to witness with his own eyes the ending he had waited more than a year to see. At that exact moment, at the crest of the hill leading down toward town, Leo's old truck came to a stop, and the man behind the wheel looked down into the valley and saw a scene his mind needed 1 second to assemble into meaning. The unfamiliar cars, the scattered crowd, and Meredith in her white dress being held hard by 2 men as they dragged her from the church steps. He didn't immediately drive down. Something deep inside him, the cold instinct he had always feared, forced him to pause for half a beat and read the field, count the men, mark each position, measure the distance, and that deathly stillness appeared on his face even from far away. And down in the churchyard, one of the 3 men in black, the one standing near the car, happened to lift his eyes toward the crest of the hill, and when he saw the figure sitting motionless in the cab, with that terrifying calm, blood completely drained from his face, because he instantly recognized that deadly, unshakable gaze. He was the only one among the intruders who knew that the man on the hill was no ordinary farmer, but a legendary phantom they all thought was buried at the bottom of the river, and they were all about to face his wrath. Leo let the truck roll down the hill and stopped at the edge of the churchyard, and when he opened the door and stepped out, amid the frightened noise of the crowd, something inside him began to break open, because the name as heavy as rolling stone that he had chased through so many nights of dreaming was now being whispered by that pale-faced man himself, with trembling lips, Lombardi, and that sound was like a key sliding into a lock, and the black curtain in his mind, the one he had prayed would remain asleep, was suddenly torn wide open all at once. Everything rushed back, the river, the bursts of gunfire, the empire along the harbor, Conrad Fisk's face, the man he had once been, Gerald Lombardi, the boss whose name had once made an entire stretch of coastline hold its breath. For one terrifying moment, his entire old life collapsed over him, and with it came the old cold instinct rising, the urge to end everything the way he had once known how to end it, fast, final, soaked in blood, and he stood there at the edge of the yard, caught between the 2 men inside himself, and he understood that this moment would decide who he truly was. He looked toward the church, saw the empty place where Poppy had just been standing, and felt grateful that the child had been taken away. Saw Meredith being held on the stone steps, her eyes searching for him, and he saw in her face not only fear but a question, and he knew the answer to that question couldn't be blood. So Gerald Lombardi did the one thing no one in that yard expected. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't charge in. He only walked forward slowly, through the crowd as it parted around him, and he spoke, and his voice wasn't loud, but it carried a cold authority that had slept for 14 months, and now made the whole yard fall silent. He said his name. He said he was Gerald Lombardi, and he looked straight at the three men in black. The effect of that name was immediate and devastating. The two men holding Meredith loosened their grip as if they had touched fire. The leader stepped back, and all three stood frozen, because every man in the underworld had grown up with that name like a legend. And the fact that the man they had been sent to collect, like a piece of property, had turned out to be the legendary boss everyone believed was dead, turned their blood to ice. Gerald didn't stop there. He turned to the lawyer Hollis Brandt, who was still standing there clutching the stack of papers, and in a deathly calm voice, he said the documents in his hands were false, that he knew exactly where they had been made and by whom, that there was no debt, no foreclosure, only a murder dressed up as procedure. And Brandt went pale because he understood that the only man on earth who could say that with such certainty was the man who was supposed to be lying at the bottom of the river. And at the exact second when the whole field of power hung by a thread, when Fisk inside the car began to realize that everything was slipping from his hands, another car roared into the yard and braked hard, and Gus Delaney rolled himself out, gasping for breath, his arms locked around the leather briefcase he had carried the whole long way. And when he saw his boss standing there in flesh and blood, the hardened man's eyes turned red. Gus lifted the briefcase high and announced before the entire crowd that inside it was evidence, records proving those papers were fabricated, the forged banking connections, and more than that, proof that Conrad Fisk himself had staged the attempted murder 14 months earlier, that everything had been copied into multiple sets and sent to places where no hand could ever take it back. Gerald stepped over to Meredith, helped her up from the stone steps, and pulled the torn shoulder of her wedding dress back into place, and even while doing that gentle thing, he never took his eyes off the three men in black, and he told them, loudly enough for the whole yard to hear, that they could choose, stand with a man whose mask had just been torn away, and who would soon collapse, or walk away right now from the lives of these people, without paying for it in blood, because he was no longer the man who would make them pay that way. And in that sentence, in the sunlit October yard before the church, Gerald Lombardi proved that real power didn't live in the gun, but in having every reason to use it and still choosing not to. Of the three men in black, the one who had gone pale on the hill, a man named Tobin Reese, whom everyone called Toby, remained frozen the longest, because for him this moment carried a weight the other two men couldn't possibly understand. Gerald stepped closer to him, and when their eyes met, the boss recognized him, and he said softly, only loud enough for Toby to hear, asking what he had told him 3 years ago, and Toby, his throat tightening, answered that Gerald had told him he didn't have to die for another man's money, that he had lowered the gun he had every right to fire and told him to walk away. Gerald nodded, and he said that today he was telling him the very same thing once more, that he didn't have to fall with Conrad Fisk, that the door leading out of this life was still open, and that the choice was in his hands right now. Toby stood there between two worlds. On one side, the boss sitting in the idling car, the man who had paid for his loyalty, and on the other side the man who had twice given him something no one had ever given him before, a chance not to be a bad man. And in that long, dragging moment, he made a choice that perhaps even he hadn't expected. He stepped back from his two companions, slowly removed the gun hidden inside his jacket, bent down and placed it on the ground, then looked up and told Gerald that he would testify, that he would tell everything he knew about Fisk, about the night in the river, about all of it. The moment Toby turned his back, Conrad Fisk's whole position collapsed like a building with its central pillar pulled out, because the other two men, who were only hired hands with no reason to die for a boss whose mask had just been stripped away, looked at each other and also let go, retreating toward their car, and the circle that had seemed unbreakable around Meredith dissolved in only a few breaths, not because a single bullet had been fired, but because the loyalty Fisk had believed he could buy turned out to be far more fragile than the debt of mercy Gerald had planted 3 years before. Inside the black car, Conrad Fisk understood that the game was over, and his first instinct was to give orders, to growl commands. But no one was listening to him anymore, and when he tried to tell the driver to gun the engine and escape, it was already too late. because from the far end of the road came the sound of sirens, county police cars rolling in to block the way, called there by Gus Delaney himself, who had calculated every step, who had sent copies of the files to a federal prosecutor before he ever set out, so that this morning wouldn't end in a gangland reckoning, but in handcuffs and arrest warrants. And this was exactly what made the Gerald Lombardi of today so different from the man he had once been, because when Conrad Fisk was led out of the car, when the man who had ordered his murder, the man who had stolen his empire, the man who had just nearly destroyed everything he loved, stood right before him within reach, the old man inside him, the man who would once have ended an enemy without hesitation, fell silent, and Gerald only looked at Fisk with a calm gaze, without hatred, without triumph, and he said he wasn't going to kill him, not because Fisk didn't deserve it, but because he no longer wanted to become the kind of thing that had to do it, that Fisk would pay in the way of the law, sitting in prison for the rest of his life like an ordinary man, and for someone who had once held so much power, that was a punishment heavier than death. Fisk was led away beneath the eyes of an entire town, his face losing its composure for the first time in his life, and when the police car carrying him disappeared at the end of the road, the dark shadow that had hung over Gerald's life for 14 months vanished with it, leaving behind a man standing in the churchyard, his hand still holding the shoulder of the woman he loved, finally free from both his enemy and the old self he had once been. When the police cars had gone, and the crowd still stood stunned in the churchyard, the truth that the whole town had just witnessed began to sink into each person, that the quiet man they had regarded as wasn't of their own for more than a year, the man who had repaired fences for one household, helped haul hay for another, the man they knew by the name Leo, was in fact an underworld boss whose name was tied to things they had only ever read about in the papers, and the looks now fixed on him carried a tangled feeling of gratitude, astonishment, and a new kind of fear. But the person on whom that truth fell the heaviest was Meredith, the woman he had just pulled free from the hands of kidnappers, the woman standing there in a wedding dress torn at the shoulder. And when the panic settled, questions and emotions surged up inside her all at once, because the man she was about to marry, the father her daughter had only just agreed to call daddy, turned out to carry in his past an entire life she had never been able to imagine. That afternoon, when the two of them finally found a private silence in the familiar kitchen, with Poppy being watched by Mrs. Ada, and still not knowing the whole of what had happened, Gerald sat across from Meredith and told her everything, hiding nothing. He told her about the man he had once been, about the empire along the harbor, about the things he had done and wasn't proud of, about the night in the river, and he let her look straight into that whole dark past without trying to soften it or paint it in kinder colors. Then he did the hardest thing of all. He told her that now she knew the truth, and he would never blame her if she wanted him to leave, that she had every right not to want a man like him anywhere near her daughter, that, if she told him to go, he would leave that very night and never come back to trouble their lives again, and he gave her that freedom completely, because he loved her enough to place the choice in her hands, instead of keeping her beside him with a sense of debt. Meredith sat silent for a very long time, and inside her there was a real struggle, because one part of her, the part of a mother who always put her daughter above all else, knew that reason told her she should be afraid, that she should push him out of her life, that a man who carried such a past might also carry dangers that hadn't yet ended. But at the same time, she looked back over more than a year, looked back at the man who had waded into the cold creek, who had helped bring the calf into the world, who had taught her daughter to draw the stars, who had twice chosen not to spill blood when he absolutely could have. And she realized that the man sitting before her was not the name in the newspapers, but the sum of all the decent choices he had made every day in this place, and that he had proven the man he wanted to become more convincingly than any promise ever could. At last she lifted her head, her eyes wet but her voice steady, and she said she wasn't sending him away, but she also couldn't pretend everything was still the same, that she needed one thing, one single thing without compromise, that he had to truly sever himself completely from the old world, not halfway, not leaving even one thread behind, because she couldn't and would never raise her child in the shadow of violence. And if he couldn't promise that honestly, then the love between them, no matter how great it was, would not be enough. Gerald looked straight into her eyes and promised, Not with easy words, but with the certainty of a man who had thought about this long before she ever demanded it, that he would hand everything over, that the man named Gerald Lombardi of the underworld would truly die today, and that the only thing he wanted to keep from his old life was the lesson that had brought him back to her doorstep. And after everything, Meredith reached across the table and took his hand. The first thing Gerald did to keep that promise was turn to Gus Delaney, the man who had walked beside him for nearly 20 years, and in the yard that had now begun to empty, he told him that everything left of the empire, everything that could still be salvaged and turned legitimate, now belonged to Gus, that he was handing it all over, not as a burden but as an act of trust, and he asked only one thing of Gus: dismantle it little by little. Bring what could be brought into the light. Let the Lombardi name end quietly instead of being prolonged with more blood. And Gus, his eyes still red, nodded and accepted the final responsibility given to him by the man he regarded as a brother, understanding that this was also their farewell to a life they had both lived for far too long. Then something no one in town expected happened, because instead of canceling, the two of them decided to hold the wedding that very afternoon, as a declaration that the horror of that morning would not be allowed to steal their great day from them. And when the news spread, the whole community, still shaken by what it had just endured, slowly returned to the church, this time not out of curiosity, but out of a new respect for the man who had chosen not to spill blood right there among them. Mrs. Ada helped Meredith mend the torn shoulder of her wedding dress. The women of the town arranged the flowers again, and when the October afternoon light slanted gold through the window panes, Meredith walked into the sanctuary for the second time that day, this time with no one dragging her away, only the man she loved waiting at the end of the aisle, and Poppy, who had been brought back and comforted, once again carried her flower basket ahead of her, with the clear, bright joy of a child whose spirit had not been stained by what she had been protected from seeing. When it came time to exchange rings, Gerald reached into his jacket pocket and took out the secret thing he had risen before dawn and driven 2 hours to collect. The thing that had stayed quietly in his pocket through all the terrifying events of that morning, and it was not the old silver ring carved with the lion, not the relic of the man he had once been, but an entirely new ring, simple and plain, a slender band of gold he had chosen himself at a small jeweler's shop in the city, a ring that carried no crest from any empire, no past at all, only what he had chosen for the beginning. He lifted it in the afternoon light, and before slipping it onto Meredith's hand, he turned it so she could see the tiny words he had asked to have engraved inside. And there, it was not the name Gerald Lombardi, but one single word, Leo, the name she herself had given him beneath the oil lamp on the night when he had been no one, and he said softly that Gerald Lombardi was the man he had once been forced to become, while Leo was the man he had chosen to be, the man she had seen before he had ever seen himself, and he wanted to step into this life as that man, her man. Meredith began to cry, and this time she didn't try to hide it, and when the ring engraved with the name Leo slid onto her finger, every last fear still lingering in her heart began to dissolve, because she understood that this man had not only spoken the words of leaving the past behind, he had turned the very symbol of their love into a declaration of it. Just as the pastor was about to speak the final words, Poppy, unable to remain in her role as flower girl for even another moment, rushed up between the two of them, wrapped her arms around both their legs, and looked up to ask in her bright voice that rang through the whole church, "So now I get to call you Daddy, right?" And the entire sanctuary broke open with laughter and tears, and Gerald bent down, lifted the little girl into his arms between himself and Meredith, and in the embrace of 3 people who had once been 3 lonely broken pieces and had found one another beside a country creek, they finally became a whole family beneath the golden afternoon light of Vermont. And that, my friend, is the story of the man once known by a name that made an entire coastline hold its breath, the man who lost every memory he had beneath a dark river, and then found again, not his old past, but his true self beside a country creek in Vermont. The thing I keep thinking about after finishing this story is not the confrontation in front of the church, not the name spoken aloud that made 3 hired men freeze where they stood, but something much quieter, that who we truly are is not measured by the power we once held, or by what we are able to do to others, but by the way we treat those weaker than ourselves when no one is forcing us to be kind. A poor woman, carrying on her shoulders a dying farm and a small child. Bent down and pulled a near-dead stranger out of the water without knowing who she was saving. And it was that uncalculated act of kindness that began everything, that gave a man who seemed to have lost every road home a chance to become a better version of himself. Because that is the second lesson this story leaves behind, that every one of us deserves a chance to begin again, to choose to become the person we want to be, instead of remaining forever imprisoned by the person circumstances once forced us to become. And sometimes all a person needs is someone who believes in them long enough for them to learn how to believe in themselves. That man twice chose to lower his weapon when he had every reason to use it, and each time he proved that true strength does not lie in the ability to destroy, but in the courage not to destroy. And the kindness he planted 3 years earlier in a stranger's life eventually came back to save him and the people he loved, as though this universe still quietly remembers every good thing we give away. Many years later, people said that the small farm had grown green and alive again, that the man who had once been a boss lived the rest of his life as a husband, a father, and a neighbor cherished by the whole town, that the little girl who had once held a flower basket grew up calling him Daddy until the day he closed his eyes, and that on that woman's hand there was always the simple ring, engraved with one single name, Leo, the name of the man love had chosen instead of the man violence had made. If this story has touched something deep inside your heart, if you believe as I believe that people can change and that kindness is never meaningless, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with the people you love, so that every day we can continue listening together to stories that reach the heart like this one. I would truly love to know how today's story made you feel, and whether in your own real life you have ever witnessed a moment when one small act of kindness changed an entire person. So please leave a few lines in the comments below and tell me, because I honestly want to hear the feelings from deep within your heart, the things you may have carried quietly for a long time, and perhaps have never told anyone. Thank you for staying with me until the very last line of this story, and before we part, I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every single day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again beside the fire of the next story.